lunch lecture of the Institute of African Studies. My name is Dominique Marshall. I'm a historian and member of the Institute at Carleton University. And it's a pleasure to welcome you all, wherever you are. The pleasure of these virtual series is that we have people from all over the world. I know of one graduate student in Ghana. Hi, Stephen. We will have 6 of these over the year, 3 each term, and we'll announce them at the end of the session. I will introduce Chris, then tell you how this is going to work. Chris Brown is a longtime colleague of Carleton University. He is from the Department of Political Science. He was, for a few years, the director of this institute. He was also the planner and coordinator and director for a while of the Bachelor in Global and International Studies at Carleton, a successful and very new program. And he has conducted research in Botswana for many years. The latest was in 2019, where he spent a year there and stumbled over the topic about which he will be lecturing today. His work in general is about Southern Africa and Canadian foreign policy towards Africa. So the way we're going to work today is Chris will speak for half an hour or so, during which I will vanish from your screen. And then I will reappear and monitor the discussion between all of you. So what I would like you to do is to write to all or to me, but to all is even better, in the chat box that you have a question. You can also write comments in the chat box as Chris is speaking if you want. I will then try to invite you in to ask your question if you want to be on video. If you don't want to be on video, just let me know. I can also convey your question in writing, but I'll assume if you have a question that you would like to come on video. And our technician for today, Femi, will bring you in. And the Q&A will last about half an hour. We will be recording this session to post on the website of the Institute of African Studies. If you would like your intervention later not to be in the recording, please write in the chat box to Femi, who is the co-host of the meeting, and he will make sure to edit your intervention out. I will ask you all during the presentation to mute your microphone. And I will then let Chris start. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Dominique. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I must say it's a little bit strange to be doing a brown bag seminar staring into a computer screen. So I do very much thank you all for taking the time to come today. And even if we can't have an in-person conversation, I hope that we can at least have a good virtual conversation. The title is quite a mouthful. We too, the people of Botswana, are a species, elephants, democracy and racism, reflections on the Botswana hunting ban controversy. So let me try and unpackage that a little bit. As the last bit suggests, this is really my personal reflections on a controversy surrounding elephants and hunting that Botswana has been involved in for the last couple of years. For those of you who might not have been following, this has been a two-pronged controversy. On the one hand, there's been a debate about whether Botswana should resume elephant hunting by revoking a 2014 wildlife hunting ban. On the other hand, there's been a debate about whether Botswana and like-minded Southern African countries should be allowed to resume the legal international trade in ivory. Certainly within Botswana, both of these measures are very strongly supported, and as I'll talk about outside Botswana, certainly the global animal rights movement very strongly opposed to these two measures. And so certainly, basically what this talk is my reflections on this controversy, and in particular my reflections on this rather large gap between how this debate was perceived inside Botswana and how it was perceived outside. The quote that I have at the start of the title is from the president of Botswana, Mokgweetsi Masisi, and it's from an interview he did with the international press. He was asked, as he was often, about 87 elephants that had allegedly been poached in northern Botswana. And he responded with some exasperation. He said, why is it that you people in the international press always ask me about dead elephants? Why don't you ever ask me about the 36 rural farmers in northern Botswana who've been killed by elephants in the last 3 years? It seems that you are far more interested in dead elephants than you are in dead Africans. And after all, we too, the people of Botswana, are a species, and we also deserve your moral consideration. So that quote, I think, points a little bit to the themes that I want to explore in this talk, themes that are identified in the 3 keywords in the middle: elephants, democracy, and racism. Oops, I'm trying to change the slide and it's not happening. There we are. Obviously, the paper is about elephants. Democracy points to the argument I'll make with respect to the domestic politics of elephants in Botswana, which is that you can really understand what went on here inside Botswana by placing it in the context of a larger struggle between Masisi and his predecessor, President Ian Khama, an effort by Masisi to reestablish democratic norms in Botswana. Racism points to the argument that I will make that, at least from the perspective of those in Botswana, this controversy revealed that in much of the West, there's still the narrative around wildlife and conservation continues to rely upon outdated racist tropes. In particular, I'll point to 3. First, the image of Africa as pristine wilderness where Black people do not exist, and therefore their interests can be ignored or downplayed. The appeal to predominantly white or Western expertise and the denial of African or Black expertise. And thirdly, and possibly most importantly for people inside Botswana, the declaration on the basis of proclaimed universal values of a right for Westerners to intervene in policy debates inside Botswana, simultaneously a tendency to ignore or delegitimize the democratic political process inside Botswana itself. So those are the main arguments that I want to try and make in this paper. Here's the outline. I'll just very briefly provide some context and background, introduce some of the main actors in this drama, and then say a few words about elephants in Botswana. I'll then talk about the domestic politics of elephants in Botswana, and I will try and contextualize the debate around elephant hunting and the wildlife hunting ban in the context of the political dispute between Presidents Masisi and former President Khama, and how that played out in terms of the 2019 election. Thirdly, then I'll look at the international politics of elephants. I'll look at the international media coverage of this story and the concerted campaign by Western animal rights advocates to block the resumption of hunting and to block the resumption of the ivory trade, and talk about how that played out at CITES, the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. And finally, I want to close with a question that many in Botswana ask, and that is, do we have here an example of so-called environmental colonialism, or eco-colonialism as it is sometimes called? So that's my agenda. To introduce some of the characters that are involved in this whole debate inside Botswana, if you will, what we have here is team ban hunting. Mike Chase is a Botswana citizen. He was born in Botswana. He has a PhD in natural resources and wildlife management. He was the founder of the NGO Elephants Without Borders. That NGO, in concert with the Department of Wildlife and National Parks in Botswana, carries out or has carried out quadrennial wildlife counts in Botswana in 2010, 2014, and 2018, which are very much regarded as the gold standard for wildlife surveys. Mike was also the driving force behind the so-called Great Elephant Census of 2015-2016, which was the first effort to count all the elephants in Africa, and is the largest wildlife survey ever undertaken anywhere in the world. All the data that I cite in this talk about elephants and numbers of elephants come from published work by Mike Chase. Derek Joubert is a South African citizen who spends much of his time in Botswana. He's a filmmaker and conservationist. He works primarily for National Geographic. He's made over 30 films. He's won 6 Emmy Awards. According to the National Geographic website, his films have been seen by over 1 billion people. His best known film, The Last Lion, is a feature-length film about lions in Botswana, narrated by Jeremy Irons. And I'll point out, it's probably the single most viewed film about Botswana in the world, so the single greatest source of information about Botswana in the world today. And there are no people who appear in that film other than Derek and his wife, Beverly, who appears in this photo as well, who appear when the credits are running. It's also worthwhile to mention that Derek Joubert has significant financial investments in the luxury safari sector in northern Botswana. And then Ian Khama is the former president of Botswana. He was the 4th president from 2008 to 2018. Before he went into politics, he was commander of the Botswana Defense Force. He has a very strong reputation internationally as a conservationist, a number of different initiatives, including the fact that he was the person that instituted the wildlife hunting ban that we're talking about in 2014. While president, he awarded both Mike Chase and Derek Joubert with Botswana's Presidential Order of Merit. And it's worthwhile pointing out that he's also has significant financial stake in the luxury safari sector in northern Botswana, including with Derek Joubert. If you will, Team Allow Hunting is represented by these 2 individuals. Mokwetsi Masisi is the current president of Botswana. He's been in power since 2018 and was the decisive victor in the 2019 election. It was he who revoked the hunting ban in 2019 and sought permission of CITES for Botswana to resume legal ivory trade. A name that people in the international community may not have heard of, but was very prominent inside Botswana, is Joseph Mbayiwa, who's a professor at the University of Botswana. He's part of the Okavango Research Institute, which is a research institute set up by the university to focus on issues related to wildlife and conservation and tourism. The Institute produces a lot of hard science research on those issues, but also a lot of social science research. And the Mbayiwa is a prolific author looking at the social and economic impacts of tourism and wildlife management in Botswana. And all the data that I'll cite in this talk related to those issues come from published works by him. Joubert, Chase, and Khama were all very prominent in the international media coverage of this dispute. Masisi was also frequently quoted, but Mbayiwa almost never appeared in the international media. So just a few words about elephants. The map here is a map of the final findings of the Great Elephant Census of 2015-16, showing the status of elephant populations in 18 countries in Africa. And as the map shows, the headline coming out of it is that elephant populations in Africa are in serious decline. Between 2017 and 2014, there was a 30% decline in the total number of elephants in Africa, bringing the total down to approximately 350,000 animals. The most serious declines were in Tanzania, which saw a 60% decline, and elsewhere. You'll notice in the map, though, Botswana is a country where the population of elephants is stable. According to the Great Elephant Census, Botswana currently has about 130,000 elephants, which makes it the single largest country in the world in terms of the elephant population, and it has about 1/3 of the total elephants in Africa. Saying a few more words about elephants in Botswana, in fact, contrary to the trends elsewhere in the continent, elephant numbers in Botswana have been growing rapidly until recently. Earlier estimates are not as firm as the current estimates from EWB and the Department of Wildlife, but the best estimates are that at the time of independence in 1966, there were approximately 11,000 elephants in Botswana. An estimate from 1984 suggested at that time there were 50,000 elephants. It's thought that the total number of elephants in Botswana reached the current number of 130,000 about 15 years ago and has remained stable ever since. An important point to note about elephants in Botswana is that most of them do not currently reside in protected areas. According to the 2018 EWB census, 20% of Botswana's elephants currently are in national parks and game reserves, which are areas where no human habitation is allowed and where hunting is strictly forbidden. 57%, the majority of elephants, are in so-called wildlife management areas, which are areas where human habitation is allowed, but where wildlife management is supposed to be the primary form of land use. In wildlife management areas, up until the 2014 hunting ban, hunting, including elephant hunting, was allowed. And 22% of elephants in Botswana are currently in communal farming areas, that are not supposed to have any wildlife at all, but are supposed to be reserved for human habitation. An important point to understand about elephants in Botswana is that historically the numbers were growing up until about 15 years ago, and that in the contemporary period, elephants are actually expanding their range in Botswana. Now, this is hotly debated between those in the West and those in Botswana as to why this is happening, but certainly the understanding in Botswana is that this reflects the high elephant densities in the national parks and game reserves and in the wildlife management areas, and elephants are moving out of those areas into surrounding communal farming areas. And this has led to a discernible uptick in the incidence of human-elephant conflict in Botswana. An important point to understand is that, at least from the perspective of people in Botswana, this increase in human-elephant conflict is arising not because humans are moving with their agricultural activities into areas of wildlife range, but rather elephants are moving out of areas of wildlife range into areas that traditionally have been exclusively for human agricultural production. Here's a map showing the wildlife or the land use zoning of Botswana. And just to look at it very briefly, Botswana has 7 national parks and game reserves, which collectively constitute 17% of its total land area. Elephants are concentrated in the north of the country. Chobe National Park, you may have heard of, has the densest population of elephants of any place in the world. As I said, in the 7 national parks and game reserves, hunting of all types is strictly forbidden and human habitation is forbidden. The yellow here, the dark yellow, are the so-called wildlife management areas, which constitute collectively 22% of Botswana's land area. These are thought to be or described as marginal areas, not suitable for agricultural production, where human settlement is allowed, but where, as I said, wildlife management is supposed to be the primary form of land use. Up until 2014, hunting was allowed and indeed encouraged under Botswana's wildlife or conservation policy of community-based natural resource management. Community-based organizations were encouraged to set up, whether it would be photographic safari operations or hunting safari operations, or to go into partnership with private operators running those operations and to manage the wildlife in this way. And the thought was that by local people seeing benefits from the wildlife in the area, that they would become protectors of those wildlife. As I said, what's happening currently is that elephants are expanding their range outside the national parks and outside the wildlife management areas. They're expanding their range into these yellow areas, which are the traditional communal farming areas in the north, and they're also starting to move south. So the first time in generations, elephants have started to appear in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve and even the Kutsi Game Reserve here. And famously, last year, or no, the year before now, an elephant even made it as far south as the suburb of Gaborone. So much for introduction. Let me now start by talking about the domestic politics of elephants in Botswana. And it's my contention that you really cannot understand the debate in Botswana around elephants without putting it in the broader context of the struggle between Mokgweetsi Masisi and Ian Khama over Masisi's attempt to reestablish democratic norms in that country following the alleged authoritarian excesses of his predecessor, Khama. Here I'll put in a shameless plug. for an article that I published in the Journal of Southern African Studies this year, Botswana Votes 2019, Two-Party Competition and the Comma Factor, which goes into these issues in much greater detail. If we look at Ian Comma, it's a sort of a contradictory picture that emerges. He was very much celebrated overseas, but very much feared at home. If we look at the international perception of Ian Comma, he had very positive press and very positive image overseas for primarily two reasons. First, he was one of the rare African leaders that was prepared to speak out strongly against the alleged human rights abuses under Robert Mugabe in next door Zimbabwe, and to call for concerted international action against Mugabe. And secondly, he had a very high profile as a conservationist, a number of different initiatives, including the 2014 wildlife hunting ban. And both of these brought him a lot of acclaim from abroad. At home in Botswana, however, Ian Comma had a much more sinister reputation. Now, I don't want to overstate this because Botswana is a democratic state, and Ian Comma's did win democratic elections in both 2009 and 2014. Nonetheless, there are very worrisome trends, and certainly many people in Botswana talked about a climate of fear that emerged during Ian Comma's rule. He tended to rule through executive decree, bypassing Parliament. He had a very hostile relationship with the press and with unions in Botswana, going so far in 2017 as charging two journalists with sedition. The charges were later withdrawn. There was a marked securitization of the state as he brought former colleagues from the military with him into government. One of the most significant of these, he established a spy agency in Botswana, the Directorate of Security and Intelligence Services, and established one of his close military comrades as the director of that agency. And there were a number of unexplained dirty tricks and other actions in Botswana, including perhaps half a dozen unexplained deaths of opponents of Ian Comma. These deaths, there were a lot of rumors about what happened to these people. Nothing has ever been proven, but certainly the rumor in Botswana links these deaths to the spy agency or in some instances directly to Ian Comma himself. So this climate of fear in Botswana during Ian Comma's rule is reflected in this 2018 Afrobarometer survey. In response to the question, do you have to be careful of what to say about politics? Afrobarometer registered a 21% increase, people responding affirmatively. And secondly, are you satisfied with the way democracy works in Botswana? Afrobarometer registered a 24% decline in the number of people who agreed. So, Mokgweetsi Masisi came to power in 2018. When he came to power, he presented himself as the man who was going to restore democratic legitimacy in Botswana after the authoritarian excesses of Ian Comma. And he undertook a number of different activities. He stopped, or he certainly returned to Parliament and enacted legislation through Parliament rather than through executive decree. He opened to the press and unions and certainly made it clear that he respected press freedom and the role of the press. And he launched a major anti-corruption drive, which included the very high-profile arrest of the individual that Ian Comma had installed as the chief of the spy agency. And so my argument is that the move by Masisi to revoke the 2014 hunting ban was really part of his much wider effort to reestablish democratic norms in Botswana. And we can contrast the way that Comma had implemented the ban with the way that Masisi moved to end it. If we look about how the ban came into place in the first place, Ian Comma, when he had banned hunting, had not brought it to Parliament. Instead, it had been done through executive decree, and he simply announced one day that hunting would end. There was no public consultation around this issue. If you know anything about politics in Botswana, you know that democracy in Botswana, there's a great emphasis put on public consultation and the necessity of public consultation for any major public policy issue. Masisi, when he came to revoke the ban, scrupulously acted through Parliament and through the established democratic processes. He instituted a debate in Parliament about the hunting ban. That debate resulted in the creation of a parliamentary committee, which toured the country for 6 months, listening to public opinion on the matter. That committee then issued a report, and based on the report, which found overwhelming support for a return to hunting, the ban was revoked. An important sidebar here is that Masisi was also quite scrupulous about respecting the rule of law. Khama had adopted what is sometimes called a militarized or a fortress approach to conservation. In particular, he'd instituted a shoot-to-kill policy for alleged poachers, and he had provided the anti-poaching unit of the Department of Wildlife and National Parks with military-style assault weapons. Both of these violated domestic Botswana law. There is no provision in the law for what amounts to extrajudicial killings by the security forces of alleged criminals, which is what a shoot-to-kill policy of poachers amounts to. And there was also, in terms of the laws governing guns in Botswana, only the army is allowed to possess military-style assault weapons, not the wildlife department. And so Masisi, when he revoked the ban, was also very careful to rescind the shoot-to-kill policy and to remove the military-style assault weapons from the anti-poaching unit and return instead them to their standard issue hunting rifles. And the last point here is much more debatable, but certainly from the perspective of those in Botswana, unlike Khama, Masisi followed the science, something that we talk a lot about these days in the context of COVID. Khama had instituted the hunting ban based on a claim that the 2010 wildlife census had shown a serious decline in wildlife numbers. In fact, that was not true. What the 2010 wildlife census had showed was a rather mixed pictures. In some parts of the country and for some species, wildlife numbers were declining. However, in other parts of the country and for other species, wildlife numbers were increasing. Elephants, the sort of key to all of this, the census was clear, their numbers were stable. So there was no particular reason in elephant numbers to justify a hunting, in wildlife numbers to justify a hunting ban. Beyond that, the 2010 EW report, to the extent that wildlife numbers were declining, had actually argued that this was because of enduring drought in northern Botswana, and it had nothing to do with potential poaching pressures. Masisi, when he reintroduced hunting, based it in part on then his reading of this same science. He looked at the 2018 EWB census, which found that wildlife numbers had rebounded and were increasing in most areas for most species, that there were no particular threats to the viability of wildlife populations in northern Botswana. And he also relied upon the social science research from Joseph Mbayua and others that showed that, if anything, the wildlife hunting ban had led to an uptick in poaching, not the other way around. A lot of people tend to assume that by banning hunting, you are going to reduce poaching. But in fact, empirically, it seemed to be that the opposite was the case. By banning hunting, what you had done is turned local people who had been seeing revenues and benefits from wildlife management, whether it be through the hunting activities, those benefits disappeared overnight. And so local people who had previously seen wildlife as a resource to be guarded now came to see wildlife as a bother and a threat. And so then they became much less vigilant and became either poachers themselves or were prepared to countenance poachers in their midst. And so clearly, at least from the point of view of those in Botswana, the science here indicated that banning hunting was in fact had led to an increase in poaching, and that removing hunting or allowing hunting again would likely lead to a decrease in poaching. So My argument is that if we look at the domestic politics of all of this, it really has to be understood in the context of the struggle between Ian Khama and Mokgweetsi Masisi. Leading up to the 2019 election, Ian Khama broke with Masisi and the Botswana Democratic Party, of which they both have been part, and formed a new party. He campaigned actively against Masisi in the 2019 election, and their dispute covered many different areas and subject matters, but in fact, the elephant hunting ban was one of the key issues in dispute. And Khama spoke frequently in the international press as well as the domestic press, criticizing Masisi's approach and calling for a retention hunting ban. Very much the election tended to vindicate Masisi's approach. He was returned with an increased majority, and Ian Khama's party was decisively defeated, receiving only about 4% of the total vote. So, turning to the international politics of elephants. Much of the international reaction to this whole controversy was driven by what I would describe as rather sensationalistic media coverage. Now, we'll see if this works. I could point to dozens of different examples. I will point to just one of the earliest, a BBC report that appeared on September 3rd, 2018. And I think if I click on that, it will magically appear. I hope everybody sees that. This is the BBC report. As you can see, it talks about dozens of elephants killed in the Botswana Wildlife Sanctuary. This is where the famous number of 87 comes from. It features pictures of orphaned baby elephants, of gory pictures of dead elephants, and a picture of Mike Chase atop his plane used for the elephant census. If I go back to the slides, I just want to highlight a couple of a few points about this report. And by the way, this report was one of the earliest reports that appeared in the international media about this whole controversy. This particular report went viral. It was picked up by scores of media organizations around the world, including our own Ottawa Citizen, which in September 2018 featured a 2 or 3 page spread with this report and accompanying gory pictures. 3 snippets from this report just to indicate the type of reporting that went on. It leads with a quote from Mike Chase saying, "I'm shocked, I'm completely astounded. The scale of elephant poaching is by far the largest I've seen or read about anywhere in Africa to date." What's striking about this is that that's flat wrong. This report came out midway through the 2018 wildlife census that Chase was leading. When the census actually came out, what it showed was that elephant poaching levels in Botswana were within the range of what's considered normal, and they were at 8% of carcass ratio. If you want to ask afterwards what that means, I will tell you. And that was far below rates of poaching as described in the Great Elephant Census for pretty well everywhere else in Africa. The continental average was 12%, and Tanzania had a rate of 26%, Angola 30%, and Mozambique 32%. So Chase's own work showed that the rate of poaching of elephants in Botswana actually was within the normal range and was far less than the rate of poaching elsewhere in Africa. The article also states, as a matter of fact, that the supposed increase in poaching in Botswana coincides with Botswana's anti-poaching unit being disarmed. Well, this was flat wrong. As I've discussed, what had actually happened was that Masisi had taken military-style assault weapons away from the anti-poaching unit and restored to them instead standard issue hunting rifles. Nonetheless, this charge that Botswana had disarmed its anti-poaching units featured in the international response to this whole controversy for months afterwards. And a third quote that I would highlight, all 3 of these quotes, by the way, are from the first 2 paragraphs of the article. It says, and this is the author of the article stating, as a matter of fact, that incidents of poaching in the country were rare, previously because of armed and well-managed anti-poaching units. And what we have here is a debatable policy position masquerading as a fact. In fact, as I've already suggested, the social science research in Botswana tends to argue the exact opposite, that a militarized approach to conservation and wildlife management tends to be counterproductive by alienating local people, and that a more community-based approach in which local people see benefits from wildlife is more successful in keeping poaching down. The international media response was accompanied by a concerted campaign by Western animal rights groups urging the government of Botswana to retain the hunting ban, to arm or rearm with assault weapons the anti-poaching unit, and to reinstitute the shoot to kill policy. Again, I'll just see if I can quickly go to one amongst many examples that I could cite. This is from the website of Humane Society International, which is based in the United States, and is reporting on an opinion poll Humane Society commissioned amongst US citizens with respect to their attitude towards elephant hunting in Botswana. A few points about that. What we see in the Humane Society here and elsewhere in the international campaign is a concerted and coordinated campaign to put pressure on Botswana. On the Humane Society website there's a petition that people can sign and a sign-on letter co-sponsored by 33 animal rights groups around the world. And certainly officials in Botswana were deluged with petitions and letters calling upon them to change their policy. I found the opinion poll particularly interesting. Humane Society did a poll of over 1,000 US citizens. They must have paid a certain amount of money for that. And they asked them, what do you think? Should elephant hunting be resumed in Botswana? And 78% of them said no. What I find interesting about that is the premise here that those who have a right to have their democratic voice heard in this subject matter are the citizens of the United States. The Humane Society never considered polling the citizens of Botswana and asking them what they felt about this subject matter. And then the third thing I would point to in terms of the Humane Society's website here is the not-so-veiled threat. With tourism now the second largest contributor to the country's GDP and a significant, oh boy, my computer's about to restart. Don't do that. I'll tell it to snooze. I hope it does. Tourism now the second largest contributor to the country's GDP and a significant employer, reinstating trophy hunting and starting elephant culls, which Botswana actually didn't call for, could hurt the country's economy. And certainly the international campaign always came back to this point. You must not resume hunting. You must rearm the anti-poaching unit. You must reinstitute the shoot to kill policy. And if you do not, we will harm you economically by boycotting your profitable tourism industry. If in Botswana, Mokgweetsi Masisi and those who called for resumption of hunting had the vast majority of the population behind them and carried the day, certainly internationally, the exact opposite was the case. And this was demonstrated most decisively at the level of CITES. Botswana and the other Southern African countries brought forward their proposal for the resumption of the international trade in ivory, and at the August 2019 meeting of CITES, that proposal was decisively defeated. Only 18% of the parties agreed to the proposal. So let me try and conclude and wrap this up. I start with two quotations which I think really point to the yawning gap between the perceptions of this issue in Botswana and in the West, in the animal rights movement in the West. Another quote from President Masisi, this time talking not to the domestic press, but not to the international press, but to the domestic press. And he says that they, that is Western animal rights groups, talk as if we are trees and grass that elephants eat. I can smell it. It's a racist onslaught. It's rather blunt language, but it's how many, I would even say most people in Botswana felt about this particular controversy. And then here's a quote from Derek Joubert. This was from a editorial that he published in the press in Botswana and internationally at the time that hunting was resumed in Botswana. And he argued that that is reintroducing elephant hunting, should be called Botswana's blood law. And the emphasis was in his original. So what I've tried to argue here is that at least the Western response to the Botswana elephant hunting controversy reveals a yawning gap in perception between how this issue is perceived in Botswana and how it was perceived outside. And it reveals also some enduring racist tropes in the people's perception of Africa, at least in the area of wildlife and conservation. For one, the image of Africa as pristine wilderness, where the interests of local people can be ignored or downplayed. We have, for instance, Derek Joubert's film that never shows any African people. We have questions about elephants being poached, but we never have questions about Black Africans being killed. Secondly, we have the phenomenon that white or Western expertise is very much to the forefront, whereas Black or African expertise is ignored or denied. Mike Chase, Derek Joubert, Ian Kama were all quoted widely in the international press. Joseph Mbayua was almost never. And certainly the data that generated inside Botswana that hunting had led to an increase in poaching, and that resuming hunting or banning hunting had led to an increase, and that resuming hunting would potentially lead to a decrease. That type of data was never brought forward. And most significantly for people in Botswana, I think there was a feeling that we had a tendency in the West based on proclaimed universal values, a shared common heritage of wildlife, of a right for Westerners to intervene in the domestic political debates in Botswana while simultaneously denying or delegitimizing the political processes in Africa. The characteristic here was not in Humane Society International, but you saw in many instances where in international animal rights movements, animal rights organizations, if they did acknowledge that there had been a consultation or a democratic process in Botswana around these issues, they would put that in scare quotes to indicate that they did not accept the legitimacy of it. So I finish with a question that many people in Botswana are asking. Do we have here an example of environmental colonialism, or what is sometimes called eco-colonialism? The idea of eco-colonialism is a concept that emerged in places as diverse as Canada or Bolivia, elsewhere, where you have indigenous struggles by indigenous peoples around issues around land and natural resources. I've seen many definitions of it, but one that I pulled from an article in an academic journal is we could define eco-colonialism or environmental colonialism as the imposition of European conservation paradigms and power structures on indigenous peoples. And the suggestion by people in Botswana is that with this controversy, we see that applied in Botswana and Africa. We see a certain nostalgia that sees Africa as a pristine wilderness and denies the presence or the importance of Black African people. We see a certain paternalism that values the expertise of Westerners and denies that Africans have expertise. We see universalism used as a way to assert Western-based values and to deny African input into these debates. We see a gross power imbalance where those who are economically powerful use that power to impose their will, for instance, through threats of economic boycotts. And from the African perspective, we see profound hypocrisy in which Africans are asked to take actions which historically those in the West failed to take to protect wildlife in their own areas. And so that's my talk. I look forward to a lively discussion.
Thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. I will welcome people's questions. I mean, one of the things we could do, because there is now 29 of us, is that we could actually all go on video, those of you who want, and keep muted so we could see the audience.
Should I
stop sharing your screen?
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
All right.
And then people could show themselves and or we'll see their name. That's lovely. And then please let me know if you want to ask a question in the chat box. That might be the easiest way, or we'll see how it goes. So is there anyone who has a question to start with? you could actually unmute yourself and do it, or so, right. Okay, so yes, Helen Kennedy has a question. Helen, do you want to show yourself then and speak, or would you like Helen?
I can see it in chat. Do you want me to just respond to the chat?
Yes, you do that, please.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody can see chat. Helen writes, do you have a sense of who is hunting elephants in Botswana? Western trophy hunters or locals? Before I get to the elephants, I just back up and say that hunting is a very deep part of culture in Botswana. And for local people, the elephant hunting ban in many respects really wasn't about trophy hunting. It was about putting food on the table. And so that was a great part of why locals were very opposed to the hunting ban. However, people do in Botswana have different, how do I say, cultural tastes. So local people, what they hunt is not the so-called big five. They do not hunt elephant, they do not hunt lions, they do not hunt giraffe or these other species. From their perspective, these are species that are not really very edible, not tasty. Instead, what local people hunt is primarily antelopes of various types, kudu, impala, springbok, etc. So banning hunting deeply impacted local people. When it comes to elephants, however, the only hunters of elephants are Westerners. Local people do not hunt elephants. They see them of no particular benefit. And so the whole elephant hunting business in Botswana is strictly a trophy hunting business. I should emphasize, however, that it is quite a remunerative one. So Westerners, and by the way, I have no understanding why people would want to do this, but Westerners who want to do this pay a lot of money for the right to go and hunt an elephant. And it's that money then that goes back into communities, or was going back into communities, via community-based organizations under Botswana's community-based natural resource management plan. And it's that money that stopped when elephant hunting was banned. That answer your question, Helen?
So she's saying on screen, it does, thank you, she says. Any other question? Emma Jane, do you see it, Chris? You see the question there?
Yeah, I could just read the questions. I'm not sure everybody sees
sure.
it. What do you see as a solution to preserve elephants and poaching? Well, actually, I should back up one step. I'm a political scientist, so I do not have any qualifications in conservation or wildlife management or anything like that. So I need to be very careful about stepping outside my own areas of expertise. I base myself, as I said, on the social science research that has been conducted in Botswana. And this is research that very much supports the idea of what has been called participatory conservation. Ian Kama, and it's quite ironic, the International Animal Rights Movement, Ian Kama and the others, have adopted what has sometimes been called a fortress conservation approach or a militarized conservation approach, in which the approach to preserving wildlife is to take out the guns and shoot people who are perceived to be poachers. And there's a profound irony that many people in Botswana pointed out, that you have international animal rights organizations that, in the name of preserving wildlife, lives of wildlife, called for summary execution of human beings, called for a shoot to kill policy, called for the arming with assault style weapons of the anti-poaching unit. So there's a deep, deep irony there. In Botswana, going back actually now 3 decades, the official policy was what they called participatory conservation, which was realized in this community-based natural resource management policy, where notionally wildlife were conceived of as the property, if you will, of local communities. And local communities were encouraged to set up whether their own organizations to run photographic safari operations or hunting safari operations, or to enter into contracts with private operators running those operations, and to gain economic benefit from them. And the research in Botswana is very clear that those organizations were largely successful. That, I mean, there are lots of issues and problems around them, we can discuss them, but the research is clear that when that policy came into place, local people started seeing wildlife as a resource to protect rather than as a nuisance to their livelihood. And when local people see the wildlife as a resource to protect, then that's the best chance for preserving wildlife populations. So certainly my view of these matters is that you end poaching not by ramping up the militarization of the conservation sector. You end poaching rather by increasing community participation in it. And a key point here is that properly managed, taking account of numbers and all the rest of it, hunting can be a part of that, at least for most of the analysts in Botswana who look at this issue. Hunting properly managed does not threaten total wildlife numbers, and hunting properly managed can be a mechanism, together with photographic safaris, through which local people derive benefits and therefore have a stake in the preservation of wildlife.
Chris, before
Yep.
you, thank you very much. Before you do that, I had a question privately, which I will ask. And then we have 4 questions from Megan, Maggie, and Mirella, which you can read. So the question that you couldn't read is, at what point could conservation become a disincentive to the operation of the local economy? And that question is from Stephen, who says, this is a question on the flip side of the argument of the wildlife activists, which say that allowing for legal hunting to commence could hurt the economy.
Yeah. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Yes, I can. So at which point could conservation become a disincentive to the operation of the local economy?
Yeah, and there's a lot of debate about complementarity versus conflictual relationships between wildlife and others, and especially the agricultural economy. And as I highlighted, one of the things that's happening in Botswana is that with the expansion of the elephant range, elephants are moving into communal farming areas that historically have not seen elephants. And you get all these stories about elephants appearing at this particular place that have not been seen in generations. And from the perspective of people in Botswana, at that point, certainly conservation is in direct contradiction with the local agricultural economy, because fundamentally you can't grow crops if there are elephants in the neighborhood. There's really basically no way of keeping them out of your fields. So at some level, certainly wildlife management and crop agriculture are incompatible, at least elephant management and crop agriculture are incompatible activities. What Botswana is trying to do, especially with the wildlife management areas, and by the way, Botswana is mostly the Kalahari Desert. It's very low rainfall, very poor soil quality. So it's not as if this is a country with a lot of high quality agricultural land to begin with. What Botswana is trying to do with the wildlife management areas is recognize that we have here a fairly large portion of the country which is marginal to agricultural production, where there are significant wildlife populations, where there are also significant human populations living, unlike in the game reserves, and where it should be possible for conservation to be at the core of the local economy, to be the main driver of the local economy. And that's kind of the basic argument behind the whole community-based natural resource management policy prior to the 2014 wildlife hunting ban by Ian Kama. But as I say, at a certain level, you can't grow crops and have at least elephant in the same area. Just doesn't happen. Now we've got a
Okay.
lot of questions. Should I just go through them?
Yeah, Megan, the next one is Megan's was sharing something about Tanzania. Maybe you want to comment on this. And after that, Maggie and Mirella.
Yeah. Megan, I mean, it's not really a question, just a comment that you've seen a BBC documentary talking about some of these same issues in Tanzania and Kenya. So yeah, I don't know the documentary, so I can't comment on it really. Megan, Maggie,
Maggie, yeah.
I'll just read it.
And
Where
then
do,
Mirella and Reba. So we've got 4 more now. Thanks.
where do institutions like elephant sanctuaries fit into the colonial narrative, or are they generally beneficial for helping elephants? I visited an elephant sanctuary once, and the goal was to help elephants heal who had been previously abused in the tourism industry. I'm wondering now if this is a colonial influence as well. I would say that elephant sanctuaries, yeah, they're, it's not a topic I've thought a lot about, but if I were to think about it off the top of my head, I would certainly say, yeah, seems to me that fits in pretty strongly to the colonial narrative. Elephants are very big animals that cover a huge, huge territory. It's amazing the ground they cover and the amount of land that they need in order to prosper. Any elephant sanctuary is merely fencing them in a space far smaller than they need for any kind of natural habitat. You know, I'm sure it's a good thing that animals who've been abused in the tourism industry are being taken care of. But my cynical self, and I try not to be cynical, but my cynical self wonders if such things are really more about fundraising for international groups than actually doing anything very much about elephants. I think, however, like I say, it's not a topic that I've gone into in great length. Hope, Maggie, that might answer a little bit. What's your question? Should I go on? Mirella, do you see a change in an anthropocentric read of the world, which I'm arguing is heavily embedded in white European construction of what it means to be human as a necessary step towards valuing local people's interests? Yes, you sound like an anthropologist and I'm a political scientist, so you put it much better than I ever would be able to. This was the thing that was most striking to me when I started to look at this topic and looking at this whole subject matter. It was the very kind of easy assumption in so much of what was in the international media and in Western animal rights groups that they, based on a proclamation of a universal shared common wildlife heritage, had every right to fully intervene in this debate in Africa, while at the same time it was fair game to deny, diminish, delegitimize African voices here. The one, I don't know why it got me, but I don't know to the extent people know very much about politics in Botswana, but you know, the sort of Freedom House rankings and these sorts of rankings of degrees of freedom and democracy in various countries around the world, Botswana's always at or very near the top of the ranking with respect to African countries. And it is Africa's longest lasting democratic system. And so the easy way with which animal rights campaigners in the United States, the United Kingdom, in Canada, and elsewhere would put into scare quotes the word democratic when referring to Botswana, or the word consultation when referring to the parliamentary committee and its consultation with people in Botswana. The easy way with which these things were dismissed, certainly for me, pointed to precisely the necessity, as you say, for a reconstruction of how we think about these matters. Well, I hope that might have answered a little bit your question. Dominique, I'll just keep going on. Is that allowed?
Yeah, that's fine. Maggie, thank you for your former answer. That was fine. And then Mirella is a communication and media studies student, no anthropology there, but yes, thank you. So that the next one is a comment on your answer to Stephen by Reba. Yeah.
Reba Molotsi. Now, Molotsi looks like it could be a Botswana name. Reba, you'll tell me if you are or not. I'm a little confused. I'm assuming that the majority of communities in Botswana do not live near the elephant habitats. That's correct. Therefore, how would community participation solve the issue of poaching? As you previously mentioned, that the rangers protect the animal life do not have to be the only solution. Yeah, one of the great ironies is that, and I don't have time to talk about everything, the tourism industry in Botswana, they've adopted the so-called high value, low volume approach to tourism, by which they mean that they want to have only tourists who pay a lot of money and a relatively small numbers. So what's evolved in Botswana is a luxury safari sector where you have to pay $2,000-$3,000 per person, US, per person per night to stay at one of these safari lodges in northern Botswana. People like Prince Harry and Meghan go to the safari lodges in northern Botswana all the time. People like you and me have trouble affording it, let me tell you. So what's evolved in Botswana is a very high cost luxury safari tourism sector, which means that virtually all the tourists are foreigners, are white tourists from Europe and North America. And it means that local people in Botswana have almost never visited their own game parks and national parks and game reserves. Many years ago, I'm going to tell an anecdote here. I was a policy advisor to the government of Botswana in the area of local government. And I organized a seminar for mayors of the then 7 municipalities in Botswana. And we had the seminar in Kasane, which is the tourist town closest to Chobe National Park in northern Botswana. And, we had the seminar and it was all fine. But, on an off afternoon, we also organized to take these 7 mayors on a game drive into the park. And what developed was that although these were senior figures, respected people in Botswana, et cetera, none of them had ever been to a game park before. None of them had ever seen an elephant before. None of them had ever seen any of this before. So for the vast majority of people living in Botswana, in fact, you're correct, Reba, the wildlife is something that exists over there. And who they are really not able to see. The vast majority of people in Botswana live in the south. In the north, population is not nearly as large, but in the north, wildlife are a constant presence. I was in Botswana in 2019, as was said, and we did go to the north. And today in the north part of Botswana, every road you drive on, you can expect at almost any time, whether you're in a game park or a wildlife management area or a communal farming area, you need to be on the alert at any time for wildlife crossing the road, in particular elephants. So although for most people in Botswana, elephants and wildlife are not part of their day-to-day existence, for people living in the wildlife areas in the north, they're a constant presence. And so it's for those people that this policy of natural resource management was really designed. So Reba, I hope that answers your question. I see that you're South African, not Botswana. Okay.
Okay, Chris, I think we are coming to a close here. There are no more questions in the chat box, and it might be a good time to close. Before I do any of this, I would like to invite you to the next lecture, and the next one is a round table on Sudan. And Femi, our technician, will show you the list, and and it will be on November the 11th, same place, same time, and registration will be opening very soon for you to do this. In fact, Femi will send you the link for the registration, all of those who have registered for this one. We had 32 people attending from everywhere, and I thank you very much. And I would also like to thank Femi of the Institute of African Studies for all his technical support. You all have a good evening or morning or night, depending on where you are in the world, and we hope to see you shortly. Goodbye.
Goodbye.